Some people carry love like a secret. They don't announce it. They don't confess it. They carry it quietly, folded inside their chest like something too fragile to survive the open air. What would you do if a stranger collapsed in the snow outside your door, and when you searched his pockets for a name, for an emergency contact, for anything, you found a photograph? Your photograph. Not the kind someone takes at a party or steals from a social media profile. The kind that comes from a surveillance camera. Grainy, time-stamped. Your face caught mid-step, mid-breath, completely unaware, from a night you barely remember. A night you spent years trying to forget. He doesn't know your name. The doctor said he may never remember who he is, but he was holding your face like it was the only thing worth surviving for. True Garrison has spent 5 years building a life so quiet the past couldn't find her. She thought she had succeeded. She was wrong. And the man she pulled from the snow, he is either the beginning of everything or the end of the life she fought so hard to keep. If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us, would you have kept the photograph? Or would you have walked away? The night True Garrison found him, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the snow was falling in thick, determined sheets. The kind of snow that doesn't ask permission, that simply erases everything it touches until the world looks clean and blank and entirely without history. She was 31 years old and had lived in that small town for 5 years, which meant she had earned the particular kind of local knowledge that allows a person to walk home in the dark without a flashlight, to know which stretch of sidewalk floods first, which neighbor leaves their porch light on all night, which corners are safe and which feel wrong. She was a woman who had taught herself to read places the way other people read faces, carefully, constantly, with one eye always on the exit. She almost missed him entirely. He was at the edge of her front path, half buried in a drift that had built up against the low wooden fence she kept meaning to paint. She saw the shape of him the way you see something wrong before you can identify what it is. A weight that didn't belong. A darkness against the white that her body registered as danger before her mind caught up. She stopped walking. She held still. The snow kept falling. Then she moved toward him. He was Korean, dressed in clothes that cost more than her monthly salary. A wool coat that had probably been beautiful before the snow got to it. Shoes that had no business being outside in this weather. He was unconscious but breathing, and his skin was dangerously cold under her fingers when she pressed them to the side of his neck to find his pulse. It was there, thin and rapid, but there. She didn't waste time wondering what a man like him was doing collapsed outside a house like hers in a town like this. She pulled out her phone and called for help, and while she waited, she did what teachers do. She organized the crisis. She talked to him in a low, steady voice, telling him help was coming, telling him to stay with her, telling him things she wasn't sure she believed, but that felt necessary to say out loud in the dark and the cold. She went through his pockets for ID. There was a wallet, no cash, but a black card and a business card in Korean that she couldn't read. There was a phone, locked and dead. There was a key card for a hotel she didn't recognize, and there was a folded square of paper. The kind that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. She unfolded it. It was a photograph, printed on regular paper but printed carefully, with the resolution of someone who had zoomed in from a larger image. The grain of a surveillance camera. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., and the date, she stared at it, 5 years and 2 months ago, almost to the week. The angle was from above and to the left, a camera mounted high on a wall, looking down at a hallway, and in the center of the frame was a woman caught mid-step, face turned slightly toward the light. True knew that coat. She knew that way of walking, slightly forward at the shoulder, always moving like she was trying not to draw attention. She knew the way the light caught the left side of that face. She knew because it was her own face, her own coat, her own body caught in a moment she had no memory of being observed. She stood in the snow for a long moment, the photograph in her hand, and the unconscious man at her feet. And she felt the clean blank world she had built around herself develop its first crack. Not a break. Not yet. Just the precise, high sound of something beginning to give. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. She folded the photograph and put it in her own pocket. They kept him overnight for observation, and he regained consciousness at just past 3 in the morning. True was still there because she had told herself she would leave after they stabilized him. And then she hadn't. She sat in the waiting area chairs that were designed to be functional rather than comfortable, and she drank bad coffee, and she did not examine her reasons for staying. The doctor was a tired man in his 50s named Gareth, who had been practicing small-town medicine long enough that nothing shocked him anymore, but who still had the grace to look concerned when he delivered bad news. The physical damage was manageable: hypothermia, a significant concussion from what appeared to be a fall on the ice, mild frostbite on the fingers of his right hand. What was not manageable, or at least not immediately, was the memory. He didn't know his name. He didn't know where he was, or how he had gotten there. When Gareth asked him to recall the last thing he remembered, the man went very still and very quiet, and the silence that followed was not the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of a room that had no floor. True watched from the doorway, and then, without any particular warning, the man turned his head and looked directly at her. Something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it. The way a song sounds familiar before you remember the name. She felt it like pressure against her sternum and forced herself to hold still. He asked, in English that carried a soul accent, who she was. She told him her name was True Garrison, that she was the one who had found him, that she was a local school teacher and not anyone important. She said it the way she had learned to introduce herself in this life, with as little weight as possible, as few handles for anyone to hold. He repeated her name. Slowly, quietly, the way you say a word in a language you're learning, testing whether it fits in your mouth, whether it means anything. True. His voice gave the word an extra half-second, like he was turning it in his hands to find the grain of it. She took the photograph out of her pocket and held it up so he could see it. His eyes tracked to it, and she watched his face for anything. A flinch, a flash of guilt, an explanation forming. What she saw instead was genuine confusion, and underneath it something she couldn't name, something that looked like pain at the edge of an answer he couldn't reach. He said he didn't know. She believed him, and that was the most frightening thing of all. By morning, they knew his name because of the business card, cross-referenced by a junior officer at the local precinct, who ran it through an international database and came back 20 minutes later looking like he'd accidentally touched a live wire. Cruz Song, 35 years old, the youngest executive director in the history of Song Global Holdings, a South Korean conglomerate with fingers in shipping, real estate, private equity, and a portfolio of acquisitions that read like a geography lesson. The kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. There was no one to call. His emergency contact number rang to a voicemail in Korean that the officer couldn't understand. And when he tried the company's main line, he was transferred 3 times and eventually told, in impeccable corporate English, that Mr. Song was traveling privately and that the company would send a representative as soon as logistically possible. In the meantime, Cruz Song was sitting up in a hospital bed in a town that didn't appear on any map of his life, with no memory of who he was and no one who would arrive quickly enough to matter. True stood in the hallway and argued with herself. The rational thing, the safe thing, the thing the version of herself who had fled one life to build another should absolutely do, was to give a statement, return the photograph to its rightful owner, and go back to her classroom where 32 children were waiting for someone who was dependable and present and entirely uncomplicated. She had a schedule. She had a routine. She had spent 5 years making her life so predictable that unpredictability couldn't find a foothold. She went back into the room instead. She told him that he could use the spare room at her house until the company representative arrived, or until his memory came back, whichever happened first. She said it briskly, practically, without sentiment. She said she had a security camera outside, and good locks on the doors, and that the offer was purely logistical. Cruz Song looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes. His voice was careful. like he was aware that he was stepping onto ground he couldn't evaluate, but that this particular ground was the only solid thing available. Like a man in a tide choosing the nearest rock, not because the rock is safe, but because it is there. She drove him home in silence. The photograph stayed in her coat pocket, pressed between her thumb and forefinger all the way. She did not take her eyes off the road. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke, he lay still for a long time in the quiet of the spare room. A room that smelled like cedar and old books, that had a window looking out at a garden buried under snow. And he tried to find himself. There were shapes in the dark behind his eyes. Not memories exactly, more like the idea of memories, emotions without context, a sense of direction without a map. He knew that he spoke Korean and English and a little Japanese. He knew that he disliked the sound of things falling. He knew that there was something unfinished, something urgent and unresolved that pulled at him from underneath the fog, like a rope tied to an anchor he couldn't see. And he knew, without knowing how he knew, that the woman in the other room was at the center of it. The first fragment came at 2 a.m. He was not quite asleep, hovering at that edge where the brain lets go of its editorial control, and a corridor opened up in front of him. Long, marble-floored, lit from above by the kind of overhead lighting that turns everything a little yellow. Voices, angry and overlapping in Korean. A door slamming. The sound of papers, a cabinet opening and closing quickly. The particular scrape of a heavy drawer pulled fast. And then footsteps, and through a window, through a reflection in dark glass. A woman in a coat passing in the hallway beyond. Not looking in. Not aware of him. Walking quickly, head slightly forward at the shoulder, moving like someone who was very good at being invisible. He came awake gasping, his heart loud in the quiet room. The snow outside the window pressed everything into silence. He lay there until morning, and did not sleep again. And in the quiet he felt, with a certainty he couldn't explain and didn't trust, that the woman in the coat was the same woman who had spoken his name back to him, like she was giving him permission to exist. True left for school at 7:15 every morning, which meant Cruz was alone in the house from that hour until mid-afternoon when she returned. Sometimes grading papers on the kitchen table, sometimes calling a colleague about something administrative, always moving through the space with the efficiency of someone who had made peace with solitude without ever quite embracing it. He explored. He couldn't help it. He was a man. He was slowly coming to understand, who processed information through his environment. The house told him things that True herself might not have intended to communicate. It was not a sad house. He wanted to be clear about that in his own mind, because the word might have fit too easily, and something in him resisted easy fits. It was a precise house. Every object was there because it had earned its place. The shelves were organized not alphabetically or by color, but by some private logic that, when he studied it long enough, started to make sense. Books that spoke to each other, that were in conversation across different years and genres and authors. There were plants everywhere, all of them healthy, which told him something about her attention and her patience. There were no photographs of family, no evidence of a past beyond 5 years prior, no old furniture dragged from a childhood home, no mementos with visible histories. She had built this place the way you build something when you know it might need to be left behind. Beautifully, but without roots you can't sever. On the 3rd day, he found the kitchen and made tea. It was an instinct, a muscle memory that his hands executed before his mind could question it. A specific kind of barley tea, roasted and nutty, brewed in a particular sequence. When she came home and smelled it, she stopped in the doorway with her coat half off and looked at him with an expression he couldn't decode. He asked if he'd done something wrong. She said no, and took the mug he offered, and drank it standing at the counter in a way that suggested she was thinking about something she wasn't going to say. He let her not say it. He was learning that True Garrison's silences were not empty. They were full of things she had decided, for now, to keep. He would later understand that the tea was a form of evidence. He didn't know that yet. A week passed. Then 2. The company representative sent a message saying there had been complications and the representative would arrive in 10 days. Then it became 2 weeks. Cruz suspected, in the way you can suspect things about yourself even without memory, that someone in the organization was not entirely disappointed that he had disappeared. In the meantime, he was learning true garrison. She argued with her coffee maker every morning as though she expected it to eventually apologize. She kept a list of books she wanted to read on a piece of paper tucked inside her current read, and she never transferred it to her phone, and she had misplaced it at least twice in the time he had been there. She laughed at things that were only slightly funny, real laughs, unguarded, and then caught herself like laughing was something she wasn't sure she had permission to do freely. She was 31. She had been teaching for 6 years, which meant she had started at 25, which was later than expected for someone who clearly loved it the way she did. He noticed this arithmetic without knowing why it seemed important. He stored it carefully. The way you store something you know will matter later. He found himself waiting for her in the evenings without deciding to. He found himself learning the sound of her key in the door and recalibrating the whole room in the direction of it. He found that when she told him about her students, a boy who was afraid of reading aloud, a girl who wrote whole stories in her notebook during math, a pair of twins who communicated in a private language no one else could parse, something in him settled in a way that nothing else managed, and the fragments kept coming. He remembered, in pieces, a very large office with a glass wall looking out over a city. A sense of relentless pressure, not external but internal, the kind that comes from knowing something you wish you didn't know. A decision made at a mahogany table that a part of him had not agreed with, a file, thick with papers, and underneath all of it, like a bass note he could feel but not quite hear, the specific shape of a mission he had given himself, private, urgent, morally complicated in ways he hadn't yet recovered enough to understand. Her face was still in the middle of all of it, always at the center. He did not tell her this. There was an evening, ordinary in all its particulars, that True would return to in her memory many times afterward. She had come home to find Cruz at the kitchen table with her grading, not doing it, just sitting with it, the way you sit with something that belongs to someone else when you want to understand the person. He had found the boy's most recent composition, the one about his grandmother's hands, and he was reading it with the focused stillness of someone who has encountered something unexpectedly moving. She stood in the doorway and watched him read. He hadn't heard her come in. There was something unbearable about it. The good kind of unbearable. The kind that presses on a place that has been numb. Here was a man with no recovered past, no reliable sense of himself, sitting in her kitchen reading a child's essay about memory and inheritance, and his face was open in a way that she suspected the recovered Cruz song had not often allowed. The amnesia had stripped something from him. The professional armor, the executive composure, the practiced management of how much of himself he permitted to show. What was left was just a person. Attentive. Undefended. Genuinely moved by a 10-year-old's description of flour-dusted palms. She must have made a sound, because he looked up. She crossed the kitchen and took the paper from him, and set it on the stack with the others. She said, "That one's my favorite this year. He writes like he's afraid to stop, like the sentences are holding something in place." Cruz said, "He's right to be afraid. Some things only stay real as long as you're describing them." She looked at him. He was not talking about the boy anymore. She knew this. He knew she knew. Neither of them said so. She made dinner, and he set the table and they talked about inconsequential things. A road closure on the east side of town. A documentary she had half-watched the week before he arrived and hadn't finished. The specific philosophy of a plant she'd been given as a gift 3 years ago and had kept alive despite it being dramatically unsuited to the available light. He listened to all of it. He asked questions about the plant that suggested he had been thinking about her relationship to living things and what it said about her. She caught herself, twice, starting a sentence with "we," as in, "we should probably, we could try," and stopping. Correcting to "I," returning to the singular. The third time, she didn't correct it. She let it stand. And the word sat between them at the table, small and enormous, and neither of them picked it up or put it away. Later, she thought, that was the moment. Not the candlelight, not the hand. That ordinary Tuesday evening with the bad overhead lighting and the plant that had no business surviving, and the boy's essay about his grandmother on the table between them. That was where the decision had already been made, quietly and without ceremony, by some part of her that didn't wait for permission. It happened on a Thursday evening. True was grating at the kitchen table, red pen in hand, and Cruz was reading in the armchair by the window, a book she had placed there without comment, as though she had decided what he needed without asking. Which he was finding was one of her qualities, a precise and unceremonious generosity. He went under without warning. It was different from the previous fragments. More vivid, more physical. He felt the cold of the marble floor through dress shoes, felt the specific way his jaw tightened when he was containing anger. The voices in Korean resolved into something almost comprehensible. Two men. One of them his father. The particular tenor of his father's voice cutting through the noise like a blade that knows where to find the gaps. And the words that kept repeating. The phrase that his brain served up in fragments and then all at once. She saw it. The woman in the hallway. She saw what was in that room. He came back to the present with a sound he didn't intend. Something between a gasp and a word, and True was beside him immediately, her hand on his arm, her voice low and steady, doing exactly what it had done in the snow, creating a perimeter of calm around a crisis. She did not make a fuss. She simply arrived and made herself solid. He looked at her. In the lamplight, in this house that smelled like cedar and barley tea, with her red pen still in her hand and papers spread across her kitchen table. He looked at her, and something behind his eyes shifted. Not memory, not quite. More like the shadow of a memory, the outline of a knowing that hadn't fully arrived. She asked if he was all right. He said yes, automatically. Then he said, and he wasn't sure why he said it, except that it felt true in the particular way that some things are true before you understand them, that he thought he had been looking for her for a very long time. She went very still. Then she stood up and went back to her papers. And for the rest of the evening, she grated with the focused attention of someone choosing, deliberately and with effort, not to examine something she had heard. It was the kind of night that creates its own permission. The power had gone out just after 8, which in a small town in the dead of winter means candles and stillness, and the awareness of another person's warmth in a way that daylight and routine usually insulate you from. They were at the kitchen table by candlelight, a board game between them that she had found in the back of a closet. Something old-fashioned and mildly competitive. And she was winning, which she was pretending not to find satisfying. He could tell she was pretending. He was learning to read her the way she read places. He watched her in the candlelight and felt something shift at the base of him, something tectonic and inevitable, the way you feel ground move before you hear it. She looked up and caught him watching, and the game stopped. The candle between them threw light at odd angles, and the snow outside pressed the silence down over everything. And there was a moment, one of those moments that exists in the space between a breath and a decision, where True Garrison looked at Crew's song as though she was recalculating something she thought she had already solved. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, not urgently, not with any demand. Just placed his hand over hers, the way you mark something on a page to return to. She didn't move her hand. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then she turned her hand over, slowly, so that her palm was facing his. And she laced her fingers through his fingers, and she looked at the joined shape of their hands on the table with an expression he understood even without words. Because it was the expression of someone who knows they are doing something that costs them, and is doing it anyway. The courage in it undid him more than any confidence could have. The power came back on at 9:15 and broke the spell cleanly, like a bell ending a round. She withdrew her hand and started putting the game away with careful, deliberate movements. He helped. Neither of them said anything about it that night. But True Garrison, lying awake at midnight with the ceiling above her and the sound of his breathing a room away, understood that she had made a choice that could not be unmade. and somewhere underneath the fear of that, something quiet and fundamental in her was relieved. 18 days after she had found him in the snow, True placed the photograph on the table between them. She had folded and unfolded it enough times herself now that the creases matched the ones he had worn into it. She laid it flat and smoothed it with the back of her hand, and then she sat back and waited. Cruz looked at it for a long time. She watched his face. She had become, without realizing it, a student of his face, of the specific way his jaw set when something troubled him, the way his eyes slowed when he was being careful, the way something moved through his expression when a fragment surfaced that he didn't fully understand. All of those things happened now, in sequence, as he looked at the photograph. He told her honestly that he didn't know why he had it. He told her that he knew he hadn't taken it. The quality and angle were clearly from a security system, and that he suspected he had obtained it rather than captured it. He told her that she was in his fragments, that her face appeared in the dark behind his memory, always in the context of something urgent and unresolved. He told her that he didn't know yet what that meant. She asked if she should be afraid of him. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated more than a quick reassurance would have offered. Then he said that he didn't believe so. He said that whatever the fragments were telling him, the emotion underneath all of it when her face appeared was not predatory. It was something older and more desperate than that. Something that felt, he said carefully, like relief. She chose to believe him. She understood that this was a choice with risk attached to it, and she made it with her eyes open, which was the only way she knew how to make choices anymore. She told him that she had been someone else before she came here, that she had left a life that had become unsafe, not physically, but in the particular way that a life becomes unsafe when the people around you have too much power over who you are allowed to be. That she had rebuilt herself, carefully and alone, and that this was the first time in 5 years that she had let someone inside the rebuild. Cruz listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he didn't offer comfort or analysis. He just said, "I know you're trusting me with something expensive. I'm going to be careful with it." She nodded once, briskly, and started making dinner, and the conversation ended there. But the air between them had changed in a way that wouldn't change back. He arrived on a Tuesday. True noticed him first at the hardware store, a man in his mid-40s in clothes too precise for the season, asking Derek behind the counter about local lodging options in the careful general way of someone who has a specific address and is gathering confirmation from adjacent sources. Derek, being Derek, pointed him toward the bed and breakfast on Maple and told him to enjoy his stay. She didn't recognize him, but something in his posture triggered the instinct she had spent 5 years trying to silence, that old, specific animal alertness that said, "This is not coincidence. This is convergence." She said nothing to Cruz that evening. She moved through dinner and the evening routine with her normal precision, but she checked the locks twice after he went to bed, and she stood at the window for a long time looking at the dark street below, at the orange pools the streetlights made in the snow, at the empty space where a parked car would not have been unusual and would have been exactly right. 2 days later, she saw the man again, parked at the end of her block. He was not subtle about it, which told her something. Either he didn't think she was observant enough to notice, or he wanted to be seen. Neither option was reassuring. Cruz's next episode was the worst and the clearest. It lasted 40 minutes. He came through it on the couch, True's hand on his shoulder, her voice a steady thread pulling him back through the dark. When it was over, he sat very still for a long time, and she waited. Then he started to talk. He was Song Global's internal investigator. That was the title, a clean corporate word for a role that was considerably more complicated in practice. He answered only to the board, and his job was to find problems before they became liabilities. Financial irregularities, regulatory violations, the kind of decisions that very powerful people made very quietly, and that left evidence for anyone patient enough to look. 3 years ago, which meant Cruz had been 32 at the time, he had opened an investigation into a transaction cluster inside Song Global's private equity arm. A series of fund movements between subsidiaries in 3 countries, time-stamped over a period of 18 months, that taken individually looked like ordinary business and taken together described something that would have ended careers and possibly freedom for several people, including at least one member of the Song family's inner circle. He had been close to finalizing his report. And then someone told him there was a witness, someone who had been in the building on the night of the most critical transaction, someone who had passed through a corridor where certain things were visible, certain conversations audible, who had been captured on a security camera at the wrong place at the wrong time and had no idea what they had walked through. He remembered being handed the photograph. He remembered looking at it for the first time. He remembered that his first thought had been professional: witness, locate, assess. He remembered his second thought, which arrived almost immediately and had no professional dimension at all. He did not tell True his second thought. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He understood that there was an order to revelations, and this one needed to wait. He said, the woman in that photograph was the thread that was going to pull the whole thing apart. And certain people in Song Global knew that, and by the time he had located her, here, in this town, in this quiet rebuilt life, someone else in the organization had found out that he was close. He had been followed. The accident on the ice had not been entirely accidental. He went silent. True said, very quietly. The man parked at the end of the block. Cruz closed his eyes. The man came to the door the next morning, when True was home and Cruz was in the kitchen. He introduced himself as a senior representative of Song Global Holdings, and he was polite in the carefully calibrated way of someone who doesn't need to be impolite because the power differential does that work for him. He spoke to True first, thanking her for her care of Mr. Song, mentioning that the company was prepared to offer a significant financial gesture of gratitude for her hospitality. Cruz came out of the kitchen and the man's demeanor shifted, a fraction, barely visible, but True caught it. There was a flicker of something that was not warmth and not quite malice, but somewhere in between. The man opened the leather document folder he was carrying and placed it on the narrow hall table. It was a dossier, organized, tabbed, meticulous. At the front, the photograph. Behind it, True's real name, not the name she used now. Her birth date, her previous address, her previous employer, the name of the family she had put 3 states between herself and behind that, the investigative file. What she had unknowingly walked through, what the camera had caught, why any of it mattered. Cruz said the man's name, once, in a warning tone. But True had already seen enough. She read fast, a teacher's skill, a survival skill, and what she read restructured the last 3 weeks with terrible efficiency. The photograph wasn't a love letter. It was evidence collection. She had been a subject in an investigation. Cruz Song had come to this town on assignment, with her face in a file, to assess a witness he'd been chasing across 3 years and 2 continents. Every morning he'd waited for her. Every cup of tea. Every fragment he'd shared with her in the dark. Every word in the candlelight. Every moment of the hand over hers on the table. She ran it all through this new filter and it fit. That was the worst part. She could see exactly how it could have been strategic, precisely because the warmth had felt real, because the best strategy always does. She had made this mistake before. Not with this man, but with this exact architecture of trust, offered too completely, used too precisely. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She didn't say his name. She didn't look at him. She walked out into the cold, and she kept walking. Cruz called after her. The sound of her name in his mouth, the way it broke at the edges, was something she chose not to stop for. She had learned, the last time, that stopping for that sound was the most expensive thing a person could do. She had not run. That distinction mattered to her as she walked. She had left. There was a difference. Even if the physical motion looked identical from the outside, a woman in a coat moving quickly away from a house through snow. Running is fear in the body. Leaving is a decision. She had decided, but her hands were shaking, which suggested the body had its own opinion. She pressed them into her coat pockets and kept walking. And she did not let herself think about the sound of her name and his voice, the particular way it had broken. because that way led to stopping, and stopping led to conversations she was not yet equipped to have. She walked to the school. It was after hours, and she had a key, and the building was dark, and she knew every corner of it. She had the advantage, in a crisis, of being somewhere she understood completely. She sat at her desk and let the feeling move through her. She was not the kind of woman who was surprised by her own grief. She had done enough of it to know its geography. The first wave always the largest, the disorientation of it, the sense of the floor tipping. She sat with it without trying to change its shape, without rushing to get to the part where she felt better. And in the quiet, she let herself go back. She had been 25 when she left. Her family, old money, old pride, the particular cruelty of people who confuse power with entitlement and entitlement with love, had spent the years of her childhood and early adulthood treating her as a variable in their own equations. She was not the daughter they'd wanted in the ways that mattered to them, which meant she was useful in other ways, presented at events, positioned in rooms, her intelligence acknowledged privately and denied publicly. When she had finally reached the limit, when she had finally said the true thing out loud in a room full of people who preferred the comfortable lie, what happened was swift and surgical. She was discredited, frozen out, made to understand that her version of reality was not one the family intended to support. She had left with a new name, a teaching certificate, and the absolute conviction that she would never again give anyone enough access to her interior life to make that kind of damage possible. And then Cru's song had fallen out of the sky and into her snow. She sat at her desk in the dark school for 2 hours. She was not crying. She was recalibrating, doing the hard, quiet, necessary work of a woman who has been wrong before and is deciding, with full information this time, what to do about it. The question, she understood, was not whether she could prove that he had lied to her. The question was more difficult than that. Whether the fragments, the candlelight, the way he said her name, the hand placed over hers in the manner of someone marking something to return to, whether any of that had been real alongside the mission, whether the two things could coexist in the same man, whether she was capable of believing they could, given everything she carried. She did not answer the question that night. She drove home, checked the locks, and slept. The company representative was still in town, which meant the pressure was active and specific. Cruz understood this clearly now, with a fully returned memory and the cold competence that had apparently been his professional identity for over a decade. He sat in True's quiet house without her in it, and he thought the investigation was completable without her. That was the first thing. He had recovered enough of his own documentation, backed up in places only he knew, protected by protocols that predated the crisis, to build a case that would survive without a witness who didn't know she was a witness. True's testimony, had he pursued it, would have been additional support. It was not the foundation, which meant he had a choice that he had not allowed himself to see clearly before, because before 3 weeks in this house the choice had not felt like a choice. It had felt like a sequence. Find the witness, assess the witness, determine whether to use the witness, finish the investigation. Now the sequence was incoherent because one of its steps was a woman who graded papers in red pen and argued with her coffee maker, and had turned her hand over in the candlelight with the careful, costly generosity of someone who does not trust easily and was trusting him anyway. He called the one member of Song Global's board he knew to be clean, a relationship that had survived years of organizational politics by virtue of mutual respect and a shared allergy to dishonesty. He spent 40 minutes on that call. At the end of it, the documents were in motion through channels that did not require True Garrison's name to appear anywhere. Not as a witness, not as a subject, not in any form. He then called the company representative at the bed and breakfast and told him that his services were no longer needed, in a tone that closed the conversation before it could open. Then he put on his coat and walked to the school. She heard him in the hallway before she saw him. She was in her classroom, which was where she went when she needed to feel competent, surrounded by evidence of work she did well, in a space where her authority was unambiguous and her purpose was clear. He stopped outside the glass pane of her classroom door. He didn't knock. He stood there, coat dark against the pale institutional wall, and he waited, Because she was starting to understand. Waiting was something Cruz Song did. He had been waiting for her for 3 years without knowing what he was waiting for. He had been standing there for a long time before she looked up and saw him. He did not look like a man rehearsing. He did not look like a man who had prepared arguments or ordered his evidence or positioned himself for maximum persuasive impact. He looked like a man who had run out of strategy and was left with only the plain, unglamorous fact of himself, standing in a school hallway in a town that was not his, in a coat that was not the right weight for the cold, unwilling to leave until she knew what she needed to know. There was something about that willingness that moved in her like water finding its level. She had been around powerful people her whole first life. She knew what it looked like when a powerful person wanted something from you, the management of it, the careful deployment of charm and pressure in alternating measure. The way need gets dressed up as generosity so you don't recognize it until it's too late. She had mistaken that performance for love once, and it had cost her everything she'd had. This was not that. She could see that clearly, standing on the other side of the glass. Cruz Song was not managing her. He was not deploying anything. He was just there, in the cold hallway, saying the true thing without armor. She understood that this was, for him, also expensive. That a man who had spent a decade being the person in the room who saw everything and revealed nothing was standing in a school hallway saying, "Here is what I feel. I have nothing else to offer. Please decide." She decided. Later, she would ask him about it. About the second thought. The one he had refused to name in the hospital room. The one he had said had no professional dimension. He would be quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something mattered. Then he would say, "It was simple. I looked at your face in that photograph and my second thought was that I hoped you were somewhere safe. That was all. That was the whole of it." She would understand then that the mission had never really stood a chance. He started talking. Not loudly. She could barely hear him through the door, but steadily, with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided not to leave anything out and is willing to stand in a school hallway for as long as it takes. He told her that she was right about the beginning, that he had come here with a file and a photograph and a professional objective, and that this was true, and he would not argue with it. He told her that he remembered now, completely, clearly, the exact moment when the mission had stopped being a mission. It was not in the candlelight. It was not the hand on the table. It was earlier, and smaller, and more devastating for its smallness. It was the morning he had come downstairs to find her standing at the counter, eating toast over the sink and reading something on her phone, entirely unaware of being observed, entirely herself in the unself-conscious way that people are when they believe they are alone. And he had stood in the doorway and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with investigation, and everything to do with the specific terror of wanting something you can't afford to want, that he was in serious trouble. He told her that her name was not in any document, not now and not ever, that he had ensured this at some cost to the elegance of his case, but at no cost he wasn't prepared to pay. He told her that he knew what her family had done, that he had read her file, the original one, the personal one, the one that had been assembled before he ever looked for the security footage, and that what had been done to her was a form of violence that did not require physical contact to be real, and he was sorry she had carried it alone for so long. He paused. Then he said, "I woke up in the snow not knowing my own name, and the only solid thing I had was the feeling that I was supposed to find you. And I know what that sounds like. I know I don't have the right to ask you to believe it. But it was the truest thing in all the fog. And I thought you deserved to know." Silence. Long enough to count her heartbeats. Then the door opened. She stood in the doorway of her own classroom, and she looked at him, and she took her time about it. She was not a woman who made decisions from the emotional surface. She had made one devastating decision from that surface at 25, and she had spent 6 years building the muscle of deliberateness. So she took her time, and she thought about what she knew. She knew that he had not used her. She knew this not from what he had just said, though what he had just said had the specific texture of something true rather than something constructed, but from the arithmetic. If his goal had been to use her as a witness, The logical move at any point in the last 3 weeks would have been to manage her, to keep her close enough to be useful and distant enough to maintain objectivity. Instead, he had made tea. He had learned the names of her plants. He had placed his hand over hers and held it there like a question, not a transaction. She knew that the architecture of what she felt was real. She had spent so long treating her own feelings as suspect that she had forgotten she was actually quite good at reading situations. She had survived a family of manipulators. She could recognize a performance. What she had seen in the fragments he shared, in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the specific quality of his attention, none of it had the texture of strategy. It had the texture of a man who was surprised by what he felt and did not know what to do with the surprise. She knew that she was 31 years old and that she had been living in a controlled experiment of one for 5 years, and that she was tired, in a specific and bone-deep way, of being the only variable. She stepped back from the doorway, not away from him, back, to make room, an invitation of geometry rather than words. He came inside. She did not explain herself, and he did not ask her to. He understood the open door. She understood that he understood it. There was a particular relief in being known by someone in that way. Recognized before the sentence is finished. Met before you arrive. She sat on the edge of one of her students' desks, and he stood near the window, and she told him something she had not told anyone in 5 years. Her real name. Not a revelation. He already knew it from the file. But an offering. A choice to give what had already been taken. To transform knowledge into trust by stripping away the last wall. He repeated it the same way he had repeated true, testing it, holding it, giving it an extra half second. Then he said, "I'm going to call you true anyway, because that's who you are now. That's who you chose to be. And I think your choices deserve more respect than your history." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. When she looked back, her eyes were bright. She said, "You are going to be so much trouble." He said, "Probably. But I have very good references." She laughed, the real kind, unguarded, catching no one but herself. The investigation concluded 11 weeks later. The documentation Cruz had secured was sufficient, meticulous, and entirely damning. The kind of case that generates 17 regulatory inquiries, 4 criminal referrals, and a board restructuring that Song Global's PR department spent 6 months trying to characterize as a planned evolution. It was not a planned evolution. 3 of the 4 criminal referrals were internal. The 4th was not. True's name appeared nowhere. The night the news broke, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and read the coverage in the way she read everything, carefully, looking for the shape behind the words. Cruz was in the kitchen making dinner, which he had become genuinely competent at over the weeks, partly from returned memory and partly from the specific motivation of wanting to be useful in a house where he had been useful to no one for too long. The smell of something with ginger and garlic and sesame was moving through the rooms. She thought about the night in that corridor 5 years ago, the one she barely remembered, the one she had filed under unremarkable because she had been too focused on her own private crisis to register what was happening beyond the glass. She had walked through the edge of someone else's history and hadn't known it. Had carried the evidence of it in her body like a splinter, invisible and inert, until a Korean man in an expensive coat had collapsed in her snow and made the splinter matter. The contingency of it was almost funny. Almost. Cruz brought 2 bowls to the table and sat across from her, and he looked at the laptop screen, and then at her face, and he asked how she was. She said, "I walked through the wrong hallway at the wrong time, and it sent a man to a small town in the middle of winter, and he nearly froze to death outside my house, and now you're making dinner in my kitchen." He said, "I prefer to think of it as the right hallway at the right time." She said, "That is an extremely optimistic interpretation." He said, "I'm a very optimistic person." She gave him a look that said she was storing this claim for future reference. He accepted the look with the equanimity of a man who has decided that being studied by True Garrison is one of the better ways to spend a life. They ate dinner. She told him about a student who had finally read aloud in class that day, the boy who was afraid, and how the whole class had listened with the specific, careful attention of children who understand that something important is happening, who go quiet in the presence of someone else's courage. Cruz listened with the quality of attention she had come to rely on. Complete, unhurried, interested in the thing itself, and not in what to say next. After dinner, she washed and he dried, which had become the division of labor through no particular negotiation, and the ordinary intimacy of it moved through her like something she had forgotten the taste of, like a language she'd thought she'd lost. He had stayed. That was the simple fact of it. His memory was back. His professional world was reassembling itself around the investigation's conclusion. His family's company was in structured chaos that would require his attention for months. He had every practical reason to return to Seoul, to the glass office and the marble corridors and the life that had been his before the snow. He had extended his stay instead, and he drove her to school in the mornings, and on weekends he sat in the armchair by the window with a book. Not because he had no other options, but because this room, this window, this specific quality of quiet that existed only inside her life, was where he chose to be. One Saturday in March, 3 months after she had found him in the snow, True was 31, Cruz was 35, and the first hints of thaw were beginning to show at the edges of the garden. She came home from a morning walk to find him crouched in the frozen dirt of her flower bed, doing something careful with a trowel. His knees were muddy. He had clearly been at it for a while. She stood at the fence and watched him. He had planted something. Bulbs, she realized, a whole row of them, in the bed nearest the fence. He must have bought them that morning, which meant he had been planning this, which meant he had thought about her garden and decided to put something in it that would come back every year, that would establish a future in the dirt of her life and return to it, reliably, every spring, without being asked. He looked up and saw her. He had mud on his left cheekbone. He said, "They're tulips. I asked at the garden center and they said tulips were reliable." She opened the gate and walked across the frozen ground toward him. She said, "Tulips come up every spring." He said, "I know. That's the point." She stopped in front of him. He was still crouched over the garden bed, looking up at her, and the light was the particular clear light of early March that makes everything look slightly more real than usual, like someone has adjusted the contrast on the world. She said, "Cruz, what exactly are you doing?" He set down the trowel. He stood up. He looked at her with that quality of absolute attention that she had stopped finding alarming and started finding essential, the way you stop finding the sound of rain alarming and start needing it to sleep. He said, "I'm planting evidence." She waited. He said, "I was going to make a very long, very articulate case for why I should stay. I had several points. I rehearsed them on the drive to the garden center." She said, "What happened to the points?" He said, "You came through the gate and I forgot all of them, which I think tells you something about the reliability of my objectivity where you're concerned." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of bulbs in the frozen ground. Then she said, "The spare room has been yours for 3 months. I stopped thinking of it as the spare room sometime around week 2. I don't know when you were planning to notice that." He looked at her. The March light was doing something unreasonable with the world, and neither of them addressed it. She took his face in her hands, careful of the mud on his cheekbone, then not careful, just leaving her thumb against it. And she kissed him, in the garden, in the remains of winter, with the tulip bulbs in the ground below them promising something green and recurring. He kissed her back the way he did everything, completely, without reservation, with his whole attention on the thing in front of him. Later, much later, when the story was theirs and not a secret anymore, people would ask True how she knew, how she had decided, what had convinced her. She would think about the hand placed over hers in the candlelight. She would think about the tea made from muscle memory he hadn't known he had. She would think about a man with no name standing in the snow, holding her photograph like a compass that had lost its north and found her instead. She would think about tulips planted in frozen ground by someone who was already planning to be there when they came up. She would say, "I found him in the snow. He was holding my picture." I didn't understand it then. And she would smile, the real one, unguarded, catching no one, and say, "But the body knows before the mind does." I was already answering before I understood the question. If True and Cruz's story moved you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share with someone who loves a love story with a twist. The next one is already coming.